This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
So welcome to you both. Thank you for being here. And I want to start by putting to both of you the question that sort of frames this session. What does make us human? What are we and who are we? And I'll begin, Thomas, with you if I can.
Okay, thanks, Ash. Making me blush, which in itself is a uniquely human trait, I believe. In some sense, of course, humans are just another animal. I mean, we made of the same flesh and blood as other creatures are. We go through the same life cycles, if you think about it. We get born, we eat, we grow, we get sick, we have sex, have offspring, and we die. Yet, on the other hand, we seem to be a very peculiar creature. We've changed the face of the earth, if you think about it, and our close relatives, the great apes, live rather inconspicuously in their remaining forests. Then, on one estimate, there's the total biomass of humans is estimated to be 8 times that of all other wild vertebrates combined. So we're extraordinarily successful, and I've always been curious about the nature of that success. So why are we the creature that we are? And why haven't other animals, including our close relatives, not acted the way we have? So to answer your question, which of course took me a whole book to write, and took me 10 years to write that book, in a nutshell, I guess, the key differences are not physical but mental, which is why I studied psychology. And I examined the major characteristics in the book quite systematically that typically have been put forward as setting us apart. Language, foresight, intelligence, reasoning about minds, culture, morality. And in each one of those, when I go and look carefully, there are quite extraordinary abilities also in other creatures. And I document them, and in particular our close relatives, the great apes, have quite sophisticated abilities. But to cut to the chase, I find that there are some things that keep reoccurring as being uniquely human. And I didn't start off with that. I started off just wanting to know. It's only really the last year and a half or so that this crystallizes the answer. The first thing is that we have the ability to form mental scenarios, be they about the past, the future, about other people's minds, about just entirely fictional scenarios, and embed them into larger narratives and think about them. And the other factor that keeps cropping up is our fundamental desire to exchange our minds, to do what we are doing right now, of telling each other stories and exchanging our experiences. To unpack that a wee bit, if I may, by creating mental scenarios of things that are not right in front of us, we can explain the present by examining how the past might have caused it. We can imagine the perspective of another person. And critically, I think, we can think about the future, which is where the mental time travel notion comes in. We travel mentally in time, as it were, and we can imagine different types of futures, and we can choose one over another and then plot a path towards that one that we desire and not the other one. And that gives us a sense of free will and power to shape the world and prepare the world to our own design in ways that perhaps other creatures cannot, which gives us a sense of free will, if you like, but also a responsibility for getting it right, because let's face it, we often get it wrong. We anticipate the future in ways that doesn't turn out to be correct. The future is uncertain. So I think the only way that an organism can make this is a very risky way of making decisions, and most animals don't do it that way. You use instincts and other learning mechanisms to guide animal behavior. And with humans, we make our decisions ourselves, and the only way to make that efficient, I think, is by employing that second factor that keeps cropping up, and that is that we are using other people's insights and experiences as a guide. So we ask questions, and we give advice, we tell stories, and thereby learn from others and build up what ultimately is our second inheritance system over and above genetic inheritance, namely culture. And through culture, we've created civilizations that then accumulate knowledge and accumulate powers that have allowed us to change the world. So there you have it in a nutshell.
Thank you very much. You can all go now. No. Rob, I want to ask you now from the point of view of your own research, how the evolutionary past has shaped human nature. Because evolution is surely an idea that most of us associate with more physical traits, I guess.
Well, I think the reason we focus on physical stuff is that you can look back at it, it fossilizes. You can measure it in ways that can be, seen to be reasonably objective and reasonably indisputable. And I think that, post-Darwin, a lot of the progress that evolutionary biology made was really looking at these physical artifacts of evolution and finding them and uncovering them, and that kind of physical knowledge is a little bit easier to hang on to. The other important thing is that, people have different levels of squeamishness about what it means to be an animal. So, what it means to be human, I've never given that a huge amount of thought. I finished reading Thomas's book this morning, and I thought it was fascinating. I thought his characterization of the gap was wonderful. But, I've always thought, well, we're just one of these little twigs on this big bush of life, and there's nothing particularly strange about us other than the things that just make us who we are. So, for some people, that's quite an exhilarating thing to think that we're very much like other animals, and that the same very banal, kind of stupid processes of natural selection that shaped all of the rest of life, which we can look at from outside with a certain degree of objectivity, I think. Those same processes have shaped these magnificent, complicated, often quite bewildering businesses of our social lives.
Right.
But in the end, what governs our what governs how we feel and how we respond to stimuli and what we think about and what we don't think about is still biological in nature. And for a very long time we've been stuck with Descartes' idea of sort of mind and body being separate, or nature and nurture being separate. And there was a wonderful quote in your book about what gives a rectangle its area. Is it its breadth or is it its width? And of course, the biological and the cultural interact enormously. And so I'm trying to remember what the question was. You open too many parentheses, sooner or later it's going to happen to you.
It'll go round in a circle. It was the question of what makes us human, but coming at it from, I guess, your point of evolution, which, as I say, is something we tend to think about more on that biological or the sort of physical, the side of physical traits.
And so just because it's harder to study behaviour, just because you have to be a whole lot cleverer about it, and just because when you have results, they're much more likely contestable, and people will claim them for their own ideological position, doesn't mean that you can't make progress in understanding behaviour. Behaviour is very much like bodies, and in fact, it requires a body in order to behave. It requires a mind, which is part of a body.
Yeah.
And so there's nothing particularly special about it.
I want to ask you both how you came to be working in these areas. Thomas, I was going to start with you and ask what led you to psychology in the first place, and to being interested in the sort of interface and the differences between humans and all those other animals.
Yeah, as I foreshadowed, it has been a question that has been on my mind as far as I can remember back. If I need to find a source, I was brought up Catholic, you see, in Germany, and there's one distinct event, maybe I'll just relay that, when maybe I was 10 or 11, who knows, we were watching the Bible or some Hollywood movie of that with Charlton Heston, I think, in it. And Cain slew Abel, and Cain went into the land of Nod and took a wife. Upon which I turn around to my mother and go like, wait a minute, where did these people come from? And my mother said, you're doubting Thomas, why do you have to ask these questions? And at that point, I realized I had to look for other sources of information, and I think I started questioning more systematically from then on in, and eventually turned to science. And virtually all my research, I'm a developmental psychologist looking at children's development, my work with apes and other animals, but all of it is ultimately driven by that question in one way or another as to why we are the peculiar creatures that we are, and how did we come to be what we are. And ultimately, I think where we come from, what we are, and where we're going are the biggest questions we can really ask.
Can I ask you to read a little from the book now?
Sure. I think I might just go with the beginning. Maybe that's the easiest. Okay, chapter 1. The Last Humans, that's the title. This book is about you, what you are and how you got here. Biology puts beyond doubt that you're an organism. Like all living organisms, humans metabolize and reproduce. Your genome uses the same dictionary as a tulip and overlaps considerably with the genetic makeup of yeast, banana, and mice. You are an animal. Like all animals, you have to eat other organisms, whether they be plants, fungus, or animal. You tend to approach things you want to eat while avoiding things that want to eat you, just as spiders do. You are a vertebrate. Like all vertebrates, your body has a spinal cord that leads up to the brain. Your skeleton is based on the same blueprint, 4 limbs and 5 digits, as that of a crocodile. You are a mammal. Like all placental mammals, you grew inside your mother and after birth received her milk, or somebody else's. Your body features the same terminal hair as a poodle. You are a primate. Like other primates, you have an immensely useful opposable thumb, and your view of the world is based on the same color vision as that of a baboon. You are a hominid. Like all hominids, you have shoulders that allow your arm to fully rotate. Monkeys don't do that. Your closest living animal relative is a chimpanzee. Yet, it would be prudent of me to call you an ape, only from a safe distance. Humans tend to think of themselves better than, or at least separate from, all other species on this planet. But every species is unique. And in that sense, humans are no different. In the tree of life, each species is a distinct branch with characteristics that set it apart from others. Humans differ from chimpanzees and other primates in some notable respects. We can lock our knees straight, have longer legs than arms, and habitually walk upright, freeing our hands to do things other than carry our weight. We have a chin. Our body surface is covered in sweat glands that provide a more efficient cooling system than those of other primates. We have lost our canines and much of our protective fur, leaving males with the apparently pointless but persistent growth of beards. The iris of our eyes is relatively small and surrounded by white rather than dark sclera, making it easy for us to identify the direction of another's gaze. Human females show no outward markers of their fertile phase, and human males lack a penis bone. These are not exactly groundbreaking traits compared to, say, the emergence of wings in birds, which predictably catapulted their bearers into a new sphere of possibility. Yet, despite this paltry list of distinct physical attributes, we have managed to seize control of much of this planet. That is because our extraordinary powers do not derive from our muscles and bones, but from our minds. It is our mental capacities that have allowed us to tame fire and invent the wheel. They enable us to construct tools that make us stronger, fiercer, faster, and more precise, resilient, and versatile than any other beast. We build machines that speed us from one place to another, even to outer space. We investigate nature and rapidly accumulate and share knowledge. We create complex artificial worlds in which we wield unheralded powers, power to shape the future and power to destroy and annihilate. We reflect on and argue about the present situation, our history, and our destiny. We envision wonderful, harmonious worlds just as easily as dreadful tyrannies. Our powers are used for good as they are for bad, and we incessantly debate about which is which. Our minds have spawned civilizations and technologies that have changed the face of the earth, while even our closest living animal relatives sit unobtrusively in their remaining forests. There appears to be a tremendous gap between human and animal minds, the nature and origin of which is the topic of this book.
Thank you. Now, Rob, you must meet a lot of people who are fascinated by what you get to think about for a living. How did you come to be working in evolutionary biology in the first place, and how did what you describe as your curiosity-driven research take its turn towards what you very evocatively describe as the mechanics of natural selection, which is reproduction?
I suppose religious fundamentalism has a part to play in my story too. I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and part of the whole edifice by which they substantiated apartheid was Christian national education, which largely meant a sort of theocratic kind of education. And so you could learn biology as long as it was about xylem and phloem cells and mitochondria and stuff like that, but you didn't ever learn about evolution, despite the fact that 45 kilometers away, some of the most important fossils ever found had been found. Now, the good thing about South African universities in the 80s was that they were truly committed to academic freedom in a way that is hard to relate to today, living in Australia. But they were fierce about teaching adaptation by natural selection. And so by the time I got there, you know, I was an angry young man, and this was my Marxism. It was this new thing that opened my world, studying exactly how evolution worked. And it was immediately apparent to me that that's the the central set of ideas you need to understand if you're going to understand what it means to be alive. And so it's always been exciting. I think I went into zoology wanting to save the natural world, as most biology students did and do, but I came out of it wanting to understand what it means to be alive.
Fantastic.
And so that's where I came from.
Wonderful. Can I ask you also to read a little bit from your book
Sure.
now?
I've been tossing up what to read about. I think I'll read from a chapter 5, Shakespearean Love. Part of the reason is that Shakespeare is dead, and so can't charge for copyright. Sting wanted the entire amount of my book advance for me to be able to say you get your money for nothing and your chicks for free, and Sting only owns 10% of that song. Mark Knopfler didn't even get back to me. So we'll quote Shakespeare instead. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alterations finds, blah, 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 blah. You've all been to weddings, you've all heard that bit. Shakespeare's sonnet 116 is as profound an expression, you'll understand why I'm so dismissive, and I'm not offending your own wedding, if you had it at your wedding. As profound an expression of eternal and unflinching love as ever was writ, exquisitely capturing the feeling that love between two people is absolute and permanent. Romantic love is one of the most profound emotions in our human repertoire. Its mysterious power routinely transforms lives, motivates great acts, and inspires sublime creativity. Yet the ultimate evolutionary reason humans have the capacity for such potent love is something so common that we take it for granted: baby making. It takes a very special form of persuasion for two independent and unrelated individuals to come together and stay together, despite their many differences, for long enough to breed. Love enables this to happen, tricking couples, sometimes only fleetingly, into feeling as though they are no more twain, but one flesh. But when we fall in love, will it last forever? Dr. Samuel Johnson famously described second marriages as the triumph of hope over experience. Yet even at a couple's first wedding, we often have to suspend in hope our disbelief that anybody can love anyone as fully or as profoundly as the wedding rites demand. Experience and ample evidence suggest that far too often love is time's fool, and in the matter of unflinching love, Shakespeare was more wrong than right. Love is many things, most of them wonderful, yet it is a rare couple for whom it is an ever-fixed mark. Many couples who are truly madly, deeply, irritatingly in love find themselves in time all out of love. Love inspires so much great literature, music, and art, yet if affairs between men and women were truly governed by Sonnet 116, both art and life would be a whole lot less interesting. We would not have Othello's jealous wrath, Hamlet's confused paralysis, the witty bickering in The Taming of the Shrew, or the star-crossed lovers Romeo and Juliet, whose kinship ties to warring clans seal their fate. To put it another way, if music be the food of love, then we are only partly nourished by torch songs, tender ballads, and love songs. Nothing can touch, let alone wash away the blues. In the coming chapters, I explore some of the deep-seated evolutionary reasons that affairs of the heart fascinate us so wickedly. At first glance, it is staggering how much courtship practices, marriage customs, and family arrangements vary among cultures and among times. Yet this variation is minuscule when viewed from the perspective of a biologist used to considering the variety of animal mating systems. Importantly, the main features of human mating systems and the ways in which economic and cultural factors modify those mating systems are predictable and understandable when viewed in the context of the evolutionary forces that shape mating. In order for you to understand what I mean, I should explain a few things about how typical mammals reproduce and how in some ways humans are more typical birds than mammals.
I would like that. Thank you very much. I'm fascinated too that this was one of the most wonderful things that I wanted to ask you about when I read the book, which was to ask how this had led you to studying the monogamous behaviour amongst fruit flies, which would surely have to be one of the most interesting research projects ever undertaken, let alone getting into your work with guppies, field crickets, mice. How do these things sort of come to bear on what you're investigating?
The fruit fly thing is a fabulous example. It was done by a guy called Bill Rice and actually by his graduate student, Brett Holland. And, you know, it's really unethical to put two people in a room and say, or on an island, unless you're filming them for reality TV,
Yes,
and
say
you
that.
should now get along and populate, and then we will take two of your offspring, etc., etc. It's unethical to enforce monogamy for all sorts of very good reasons. However, if you wanted to enforce monogamy in fruit flies, nobody's going to stop you. And the point here is...
Do you think the fruit flies would stop you? No, that's a whole other...
The point here is that the interests of a male and a female, even a mummy and daddy who love each other very much and want to stay together forever and ever, they are never identical. Because if one individual dies, if one partner dies, the other one could remarry. Or if they get divorced, or something like that, okay? I am more valuable to myself than I am to my partner, and I always will be. And she is more valuable to herself than she is to me, because more of her future is wrapped up in herself. Very abstract kind of way of putting it. Now, with fruit flies, what you can do is say, they fight and they conflict and they have disgusting toxins in their sperm that actually incidentally kill the female because they're trying to kill the sperm of the male, etc., etc. This experiment, they've enforced monogamy for something like 100 generations, and then in another line, they've just let them go off and do their usual free-for-all thing. And what happens when you do that is the free-for-all ones, subsequently it's been found after writing this book that they're actually smarter. The males are actually smarter because they have to outwit their rivals. But the population grows more slowly, and all the individuals don't really thrive. Whereas if you enforce monogamy, individuals thrive, they take their time reproducing, they invest more in each of their offspring because the conflict has been completely removed. Their future is identical. If the partner dies, you might as well be dead. And so this enforcing of monogamy gives us a bit of an insight into the differences of interest and how they might shape things over many, many generations, depending on the ways in which you allow couplings to happen.
I found that whole section absolutely fascinating. It's, you know, Drosophila give us many things, but I never thought they'd give me a really intriguing study on monogamy. Thomas, you've spent quite a lot of time working with those creatures most closely related to us. What kinds of experiences has that opened up for you? What sort of places have you found yourself in with the great apes?
That's a very big question. Yes, I've been working with great apes, with other animals also more distantly related, like dolphins, dogs, etc., ravens. But let me tell you about small apes, because while chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans are very commonly known, our closest relatives, the great apes, few people seem to be aware about the position of small apes. They are on the tree of life, somewhere in between great apes and monkeys. Monkeys are the smaller versions, you know, with the tail. Apes don't have a tail, and they have bigger brains, and they have that capacity to move their arm around. And anyway, we know quite a bit about monkey psychology, if you like, and about great apes, and not so much about small apes. So I applied for the Australian Research Council for some grant a few years ago to find out more about the mental capacities of small apes. And now I know why we don't know so much, because it's really, really hard to work with them. So when I work with a chimpanzee, I can sit next to the chimpanzee, and you'll be my chimpanzee, and I'll do an experiment and hide some food or whatever it is, and the chimpanzee, I give him a choice, he will point out, it's here, it's there, you give him that, and then afterwards you groom each other. You can relate on some level. And with the gibbons, it doesn't work that way. Gibbons are much smaller and much more flighty, so they would come there and spend 5 seconds looking at your task, and then they're off doing some kind of acrobatics. They're the ones that fly through the canopy. The first one I ever met, to give you a bit of an anecdote, I guess, I met a white-handed gibbon in Sumatra in the Gunung Leuser National Park, which is, by the way, under threat at the moment. If you don't buy any palm oil, they're chopping it down for that reason. Anyway, so I was trying to follow some orangutans, and suddenly I felt something on my arm. And a gibbon had used my arm as if it was a tree branch, swinging from my arm to the next branch and then forward, landing in front of me on this tiny little path. And while they're extremely elegant in the canopy, on the ground they're very much less elegant. They move a bit, should I? Oh, why not? They go like this, with these improbable long arms and very short legs. And it came waddling up to me, which was extremely cute. So I sat down and let him approach, and eventually he actually did come and jumped on my lap. I stroked him, and I promptly got bitten. Anyway, they're very interesting.
But they don't play as nicely as other creatures.
Well,
they're a bit more like working with toddlers, maybe, than
I beg your pardon?
A bit more like working with a toddler than with a 4-year-old. Say.
Yeah, I'm foolish. I work with both animals and children.
Yeah, there's a famous quote about that somewhere.
Yeah.
But, I wanted to ask both of you, given that we're talking today under the auspices of the Writers' Festival, I wanted to talk to you both a little bit about the importance of being able to write, as both of you do very beautifully, but being able to write about your areas of interest, partly in the context of the kind of craft of your own writing and, you know, how you feel about that and what you enjoy about it, but also in the context of the broader importance of communicating science and communicating ideas. And there are two sides to a question like this, I guess. First of all, it is about communicating ideas to people like me who sit on the other side of the fence, on the humanities side of the fence, but also in terms of communication between disciplines and how different areas of research can feed each other. Would either of you like to start with that?
I'm happy to start, yeah.
Yeah.
I write academically in my research papers for other academics in my field, and that's sometimes a very technical way of reporting what you find. But I always am keen to kind of insert a little bit of something here and there, because I get bored. I get really bored with writing that is just too technical, and I have to read a lot, being a professor at uni. And so I'm very grateful when people can make things a bit more interesting and palatable and don't obfuscate. So there are certain writers, I don't know, Jared Diamond, Steven Pinker, etc., that manage to captivate people and communicate across disciplines. And I've tried to emulate that somewhat. English is my second language, and you don't have to read the book with a German accent, but polishing it again and again, it's a craft, it's not an art. You just do it again and again until you think it is readable and accessible. Most of my work is cross-disciplinary. I do developmental, comparative work, I'm a cognitive psychologist, neuroscience, etc. So I straddle various disciplines. So there's a great benefit, I think, for doing that, in that you can learn lessons in one field and then apply it to another field. And so I don't know, I invented a test for documenting how children acquire a certain skill, and then I think about how can I possibly give a similar test to apes and see whether they have the similar abilities and vice versa. So you can cross-fertilize. And I think that's really important, because you can get these, what are they called, blinkers on, right, in disciplines where you just don't see what's going on around you, and that can be really dangerous. And of course, for the general public, I think it's important and critical for researchers to communicate what they find to everybody, because otherwise, what's the point, really? Yeah.
Rob, it's obviously something that matters to you, because you're fantastic at sort of engaging with the public. You've got a very interesting area to work with, but you seem very committed to sort of communicating in that way.
I think it's part of the deal. I think that if you accept, governments, at least until now, we're all very nervous now, but, the Australian government, since I've been in Australia, have been very generous in supporting the research that I do. And really, I make no claims that I'm going to fix any problem. I sometimes suggest that I'll give insights into how we age, which are genuine insights, but they're not clinical insights or anything like that. And what they get for the deal is simply a more educated public. And so you can teach the students that come into your classes at university, but I think a huge part of the deal is taking that knowledge and exploring what it means with a much broader range of people who aren't currently at university, or who never had the chance to go, or who are just curious. And the public are smart, and they're there waiting for interesting new stories and new research. And some people will consume sort of Gladwellian narrative fiction, and for some people we like it a little bit more substantial, I think. And so, I think that there's a space for lots of different types of writers. Probably never going to make a living doing it. Well, very few people will, but it's tremendous fun as well. And Terry Pratchett is one of my favourite fiction authors, says it's the most fun you can have in a room on your own. I get to write about sex, so
It only
yeah, I
gets
think
better.
I've trumped him.
It's not many people who can claim that. Thomas, I wanted to ask you specifically about the aspects of your work that discuss imagination, the imagination that we're capable of. And at one point you write, I think it's from the section that you read out, that we can imagine things other than what is available to the senses. We can picture a past and a future and entirely fictional worlds and think about them. Now that's probably the most accurate description of my job as a novelist as I've ever come across. But you're interested beyond this in our desire to link our minds through language and narrative and writing and our sort of capacity for empathy in that way. Again, as a novelist, these three ideas of imagination and narrative and empathy are completely irresistible. I think they would be for anyone who's a writer or anyone who's a reader. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about imagination in the context of The Gap and in the context of your own kind of work and your own kind of thinking.
Yeah, I do think it's a critical component of what makes us human, absolutely. Remember, I was at the beginning saying there's two factors. One is this capacity to construct scenarios, which is effectively imagination, and embed them into larger narratives. So that is certainly a critical component of who we are, and communicating that to others is your job directly, right? And in writing, with writing, we've been able to do that in a much more effective way. And there are time capsules because you don't have to communicate one-on-one. We can share in the knowledge of everybody else. And Aristotle's writings, we can still hear his voice, as it were, by looking at it. And in that sense, it's extraordinarily powerful that we can accumulate cultural knowledge through our writing system. Now, let me say briefly, though, that I'm not saying that other animals don't have imagination. They might very well do. For starters, most mammals have, or all mammals have REM sleep, so they might very well dream. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans can certainly reason about things that they didn't see. So I've done studies of that sort where they have to infer where an object is or where I've displaced something, and they can do that. They can make inferences. And similarly, they have empathy to some extent as well. It's not that they are totally oblivious to what goes on in others. For example, chimpanzees console each other when another individual is in distress. For example, there's a fight between two individuals, one of them gets beaten up. The one that gets beaten up receives more hugs and kisses from the group, and more so after strong fights, after heavy fights, than after minor fights, suggesting there is some level of sympathy there. But it's a step from that to what we seem to be able to do even when we don't observe anything. We can empathize with fictional characters, with things that have happened in the past or that may or may not happen in the future. And that is tremendously powerful and open-ended in the way that we can combine and recombine basic elements into novel narratives, just as we can combine and recombine words into novel sentences or notes into novel songs. So this open-endedness, we don't have a sign of that at all in the great apes. That fuels our imagination, our generativity, if you like, that is so characteristic in many of our domains.
It must be, I mean, it would be fascinating. Is it something that you would be interested in trying to unravel further, the kind of role of or the presence of imagination, I guess, in our closest relatives?
Well, I do, yes. I mean, and I have worked on that. And it's, for example, I mean, one way in which human children first express imagination is pretend play. With around 18 to 24 months, virtually all infants start to, or toddlers, I should say, at that point, start to pretend. So this banana is a telephone or something, right? So where they have two representations of the world the way it is, and the world the way the world is imagined to be. And they don't really confuse one for the other. They don't typically eat their mud pies. Some of them might try, but they have two representations of the same thing. And there are some other creatures that do that, and that's the great apes. So chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas all have been observed when raised amongst humans to also engage in these kind of actions. In the wild, we haven't got any, well, there's one dodgy proposal, but there's little suggestion that they do that. But it's hard to say, because how do you distinguish a certain action when somebody bolts into the distance? Are they bolting because they actually saw something to run away from, or are they just pretending? It's hard to say. But there are signs that the great apes have some pretend capacity that we don't see in small apes or monkeys. So they are, in this domain, as in many other domains, very much our closest relatives. And when they go extinct, if they go extinct, and they're all on the way out if we don't do anything about it, then that gap will be wider, because then our closest relatives will be monkeys and not apes. So I'd like to encourage everybody to try to do whatever bit you can to help conservation.
Now, Rob, I think for some people they have a genuine anxiety about what they perceive to be sort of big ideas like evolution, as if they're going to be, kind of tricky concepts that come couched in quite impenetrable language. And one of the things I loved about the book was how accessible you made it feel and how very personal. And the chapter that you read out before, I think, gives a really clear indication of how you sort of tell the stories you want to tell. Now, reducing natural selection in a way so you can think about it in terms of survival, in terms of reproduction and ancestry, that made it marvellously accessible. And then you step into this idea that this helps us sort of deal with the variation in our circumstances. And I was particularly taken with the way you developed the idea of evolutionary biology into questions that examine how we love. And as I say, the section that you read before on the ultimate evolutionary reason that humans have the capacity for such potent love. I don't think that's an area many readers would think of evolutionary biologists engaging with. How do people react to having what they would think of as a purely emotional reaction or decision kind of investigated and decoded in this way?
The only reaction I can recall is after I gave a talk at a Linguistics Association conference. And I know nothing about linguistics, but I was trying to explore the idea that a lot of our language is about negotiating the conflicting interests that surround mating and, persuading someone to mate with you, and perhaps it's not as much in their interests as it is in your interests, and persuading somebody, the negotiations that happen all the time. And somebody put up their hand and said, but what about love? And yes, what about it? It's a remarkable, probably suite of emotions. I think that the neurochemical basis of how we fall in love, or how we love our children, how we bond with our children, how we love our family in a different kind of a way, all of those, co-opt many of the same mechanisms, the same hormones, the same receptors in slightly different kinds of doses.
Yeah.
You can get to those things by studying fairly banal mechanical mechanisms. Now, most of what I do is not very mechanistic. I don't really necessarily study exactly how these things are put together, although in the book we explore some of them, but more their net effect, because in the end it's their effect that has an influence on fitness. So for some people, it's the classic problem that science always faces, are you unweaving the rainbow, or are you simply enhancing it? Are you making, I think people who are sympathetic to science, who are interested in science, can completely understand that we get that sense of wonder about how amazing the world is, even when it's a little bit nastier and perhaps a little bit less romantic than you might have dreamed it would be. We can still get a huge sense of wonder about that, even if we demystify it a little bit. I know a couple of people who've had some pretty heinous relationship issues unfold, and in talking to them about the nature of sexual conflict, not diagnosing them, I'm no analyst or anything like that, but in simply exploring the idea that, it's not all roses, that often it can be, the furthest thing possible from that. Thinking about those things in a kind of abstract way has helped them see their own situations in a much greater perspective. So, for everybody who suggests that I'm unromantic and therefore, must be on the wrong track, there are other people who are quite open to this quite dark view, I mean, the really interesting stuff in literature and music is the dark stuff. And that has it's not just an aberration, it's there for a reason.
So can you see yourself as the world's first evolutionary biological agony aunt? Do you think there's a future in that?
There is a flaming redhead living in Los Angeles called Amy Elcon, Advice Goddess on Twitter. And she goes to the Human Behavior and Evolution Society meetings every year, and she is a celebrity there because she turns up and she studies all the evolutionary stuff, and then she actually answers advice. She's also got this amazing sort of reactionary kind of political sensibility, which is sometimes a little unfortunate because sometimes evolutionary biologists are cast that way. I think evolutionary thinking is often very progressive politically too, and can be. but not in Amy's particular case. So usually people have to just toughen up and, put on some makeup and some high heels and go
Right.
out there and try again,
Well, I look forward to that. I look forward to seeing you try. Okay, I'm just going to ask one more question and then I'll let you all have your go. Cooperation was something that you both discussed in your books. Now, I have to say, it doesn't always feel like we're a cooperative species, and recent weeks and recent budgets haven't been much good for making us feel better about it. But I loved your line, Rob, about us being a freakishly cooperative species.
I think we're freakishly cooperative so if you line all the organisms up by their kind of mating system, on the one side you'd have the Drosophilas with their nasty seminal peptides that destroy their mate as soon as she's laid eggs for them, or the penis-fencing flatworms that try to be the sperm deliverer and not the egg deliverer, because they can do both at the same time.
God.
And it's all very nasty and medieval. And then down the other end, you've got seabirds like albatrosses that sit on a lonely kind of windswept, godforsaken island and bring fish to these chicks and feed them, and it takes all the work a mummy and a daddy can do to fledge one chick in a season, and then that chick goes off, and so they know each other really well and really intimately. And if one dies, they never divorce, because the costs of finding another mate and then learning to live with that other mate and stuff are just too high. But if one dies, they really struggle for several years and sort of languish, not because they're emotionally missing them, but because they don't really know how the other one works, and they're not a good team anymore. Okay, and so if you take that's the animal mating sort of world. Humans are right down this end. They're right
there
down
with the albatross.
Near the albatrosses. Yes. Not to be too metaphorical about it.
I like it.
So they tend, it takes a tremendous amount of hard work. But in humans, of course, it's not just a mummy and a daddy, of course. There's also a much extended family, usually the woman's family. But we have a fairly infinite variety of possible ways in which we do this, but it takes an enormous amount of hard work to fledge one of these things, and many of you, I imagine, are still wondering if you ever will fledge them in their 30s. It's a lot of work, and so we tend to be much more cooperative. It just happens to be that the interesting stuff is where we don't see eye to eye.
Yeah. And Thomas, in your...
Yeah, my cooperation is, of course, more than just mating. So there's also the culture that we have created by cooperating. And that's a huge problem in evolutionary biology, because you can explain cooperation where both individuals benefit quite easily. So you've got symbiosis between species, etc. You, for example, are all hosts to 10 times more bacteria in your body than there are body cells in you. Let that one sink in. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? It's just recently been found out. So you are therefore cooperating, as it were, in making it possible for these bacteria to live. So cooperation between species is easy to explain. Cooperation between close relatives is easy to explain, because you can pass on your genes indirectly through your kin. And that's where the mating comes in as well. But the very curious thing is, how do you get cooperation between non-related individuals going? Like we do right now. We're cooperating in a way, even if we're not directly related with each other. And that typically gets explained through reciprocity. I scratch your back, if you scratch mine, you give and take. But the problem with that is, and why that's not so common in the natural world and in other animals, is because people can cheat, or individuals can cheat. So you can get all the benefits without paying the price. And so economic theory has got a lot to do with trying to explain how on earth we pulled that one off. And one way in which we did pull it off, I think, is indirect reciprocity, as it were, where we impose on others costs and benefits for being cooperative, for being nice and being good. And we're willing to go out of our way to punish somebody, even if it costs us something, to get them back in line. And lots of experiments have been done in the last couple of years showing that people are doing that even in anonymous situations. So you could walk away with $100 in some economic game, or you can give $80 to punish that guy over there that has been cheating. And people are willing to do it. They're just actually willing to sacrifice their own benefit for the greater good, as it were. So there's lots of dimensions to this cultural evolution, and morality, of course, comes in there as well, where we have the obligatory and the virtues that we encourage in order for us to cooperate effectively. And of course, through cooperation, we have been able to create these civilizations that really have changed our world entirely.
Thank you. Okay, it's time for everyone to cooperate. I think there are going to be some microphones if anyone has a question for Rob or Thomas. Yep, there's someone just near the camera.
I'm interested in how you feel about the ethics of eating animals, given your understanding of how close we are to animals.
Is it for me? Well, it is part of our natural diet, I'm afraid. So we like other primates, like chimpanzees eat meat as well. They hunt for food at times. Even bonobos, who we thought were just frugivores, also have been observed hunting now. And that has changed even more so about 2 million years ago, where we've got evidence that our diet has changed, our gut has shrunk, meaning that we've got a higher energy load from our diet. It looks like we've become the top began to become the top predator from around 2 million years onwards, from Homo erectus onwards. So it's part of us, but that doesn't mean you don't have to, of course. And the ethical implications of us mass farming animals, like the way we treat chicken and pigs in the food industry, is really, frankly, appalling. And in that sense, one might very well choose to be a vegetarian instead. But you have to consume some organism. You will always have to consume some organism. You only have the freedom to decide which ones, not consume any.
For now, because after it's all been strip mined, it's going to be grown in a tissue culture.
Yes, it's
There might be
isn't it
possibilities.
the man in America who's invented the dubiously named Soylent that we're all going to start.
He wants to get some marketing people to look at that
I
name.
know, I thought it was an interesting choice. Okay, there's a question here and then a lady over here.
Is there any case of our animals using storytelling as a way of communicating?
So the question
No.
is there any example of other animals using storytelling as a way of communicating?
No, I don't have any evidence for that at all. And it is the narrative storytelling that allows us to connect in ways that others don't. And other primates, they bond through grooming each other. On one-on-one, you groom each other and you relax, and then you do tit for tat. You help those that help you, and they form alliances, as friendships that way. But they don't exchange stories about what happened to me earlier this morning. And that kind of declaration, even the language-trained animals. So we've got all kinds of experiments where people have tried to teach our close relatives symbol systems, and some of them were quite successful. None of them really involve the animals telling us a yarn about, or their political persuasion, or some speculation of what should happen next month. It's more about, you chase me, give me banana, sort of thing. And encapsulated really to be as if they're trapped in the here and now, in some sense of the word, I guess.
And there was another question here, yeah?
Yes, Thomas, I'm wondering about the role of literacy, actually. It seems to me that the description that you were giving of the gap between humans and other animals almost presuppose, or it slid around a bit on the notion of literacy, because a lot of the things about building on what people have done before us, imagining the future, the development of civilization even, in fact are dependent on literacy, and yet in terms of our humanity, literacy is obviously not essential. So, how do you feel about the role that literacy has played, and if you strip that out, how big would the gap be?
Well, it would be still absolutely enormous, because non-literal societies are also human. So clearly they have also. Yeah, but most of my last chapter is exactly on literacy and how we've invented writing, which, incidentally, do I have a minute?
Yeah.
Okay, so because I think it's really cool, because the people that invented writing were accountants in the Middle East, who kept track of trade through so-called clay bullaes. They already had pottery, and they made these balls, and they used little tokens to represent a sack of grain or a sheep or whatever it is. And interactions like paying tax or putting stuff on a caravan was documented in these clay bullets. So you have this ball, and you put the things inside, you fire it, and then you store it away. But then every time there's a dispute, you have to destroy the thing. So somebody clever came up with the idea of taking the bullae, so that some of them are triangular, others are round, etc., and press it on the outside, and then put them inside. So if you've got 3 round impressions there on the outside, then you know there's 3 balls on the inside. And within a generation, people realized, like, well, you don't have to put anything on the inside if the information is on the outside. And within 150 years or so, these round things turned into cuneiform tablets, right, clay tablets. And for the first few hundred years, all they've written down was these kind of boring interactions of account keeping and taxes, etc. And then people started to write down what actually matters to us today, you know, like creation myths and who did what to whom and what happened next. And the rest is history, literally. And I think that happened around 4,000 years ago, and over that period then, our cultural and civilizations has gone like that in terms of being able to accumulate knowledge. So the libraries of the world are really other receptacles of all our accumulated knowledge, and we can still communicate with the brightest minds of the world that have ever lived, and untiringly they will tell you what their insights were, which is just extraordinary and has allowed us to accelerate in our knowledge acquisition the world has never seen before. And today's internet and other modern days communication systems is a natural extension of that drive to exchange our minds and to link our minds together and build ever more sophisticated systems of cooperation.
There's a question just over here.
Yeah, why do you think it would have taken so long to work out that you only have to do the imprint outside and you don't have to put it into the urn?
Oh, it didn't take long. It didn't take long at all.
How many years did you say it was?
Oh, within a generation or so, I said. We don't have the exact dates because you find bits.
Why? What stops us from having the imagination of doing it? We now can all work it out in 5 seconds. Even a matter of years is a long time. And then
well, we don't know, because there's no history at that point where people have written down exactly what happened.
And then related to that is, why did it take so long to work out the trial by ordeal of witches is a silly thing, like it doesn't make sense. You know, the idea when we used to...
Well, there are a lot of things we still do that don't make sense, I'd say.
Why?
Why? We can only hope to get wiser as we accumulate our knowledge, but of course a lot of ideas get perpetuated. If they're not too harmful in the meantime, they can be part of a cultural heritage of a group for a long time. We can only hope that we get wiser as we grow.
And I did read something, and I'm sorry, I've been reading a lot recently, so I can't remember if it was in Rob's book or not, and he'll look really blank if I say this, but I read somewhere fantastically recently that said the trials of witches were actually perpetuated by the merchants who sold the wood. So they kept them going because they were making a gain, they were making a profit on selling the wood that would be needed to burn the witches. You know, it clearly wasn't you because
no
you're
more
not
forests,
leaping
no more
in.
witches.
So I have no memory of where I read that, but yes, if that helps you in any way, you can blame the wood merchants for that one. There was a lady right down the back, I think, and that's probably going to be our last question. There's a microphone just behind you.
I just wondered, if you're talking about what makes us human, where does religion fit in?
Well, religion is definitely one of the characteristics that sets us apart because it's our attempt at making sense of the world. And in some sense, one aspect of religion is, of course, it gives us comfort for the most unwelcome of all realizations, and that is our own ultimate demise, which you only get confronted with when you can think about future situations. So an animal that can't think about its individual future in the same way isn't confronted with that anxiety of one's own ultimate passing away. And it gives us comfort, I think, to think that we will continue to exist. And if you think about it, there's no natural way of stopping to think about the future. You can't just think 1 week or 2 weeks or 2 years or 10 years in the future. You can very well think beyond the future that you're actually going to live. And therefore, why not imagine also that you continue to exist? So that's, I think, one fundamental aspect that most religions deal with. But religions have many other functions of supporting morality and therefore culture within different groups that is now being studied as a part of our natural history as well. It's like, how did religions evolve? So the major moral religions of this world today, many of them have their roots around 2,500 years ago. So where you have Socrates in Greece, you've got Buddha in India, Confucius in China, Zoroaster in Persia, they all lived around the same time. It's not that they suddenly had some great insight that made them so important. What happened then, really, if you think about it, is that writing became used for the purposes of documenting these things. And therefore the teachings, if they were insightful, could last. And people didn't just spread it by word of mouth, but you could always come back to the original text. And that's why they have such an extraordinarily lasting influence. So it is all wound up in the evolution of our culture as well. But of course, the whole topic of religion, there's many, many other facets to it. I don't know whether you want to add.
I think that's right. I think religions show us a great deal about what it means and what it has meant to be human, partly because religions tend to have these self-insulating kind of rules. You can't question it, otherwise you're a heretic or an apostate or whatever. And so they tend to fossilize culture in a way that other institutions move a whole lot more quickly and a whole lot more nimbly, which means that sometimes religions are left perhaps harking back to 500 or 600 years ago in some cases. And so, and of course they leave texts as well, so we can understand a great deal of what it meant to be alive 2,000 years ago in those parts of the world you just mentioned, partly because of the writing, but partly because the teachings kind of ossified around this notion that you can't question it and therefore it can't be changed.
It's in a sense, it's the ultimate form of indirect reciprocity, because instead of us policing each other, you're policing yourself. If you've got a conscience that says, well, if I get caught doing it, I don't have to get caught doing something that violates a moral rule, I will be punished all the same, nonetheless, in some afterlife or some other divine tribunal. So therefore, it keeps people even more in check, and therefore was a great catalyst for greater cooperation. You've got to hand it to that, to religion, I think.
On which, surprising note, I'm going to send you all upstairs where you will find Thomas and Rob. I would like to thank both of them very much for talking with us today, and thank you all as well.
Thanks, Ash.
Thank you, Ash.